going on, guys? Dave with Miracle Canine Training here with another Q&A for you guys. We've been slacking on these. We posted about a week ago that we were going to do a Q&A, and we're just getting around to it now. So sorry, we've had a lot going on. Lots of things in the works right now. Our facility renovations are pretty much done. If any of you guys have been to the facility in a while, you've seen it. It's come quite a long way in the last about 2 months. A couple minor things to finish up there, but that's looking really good. I have a 2-day behavioral workshop in Tampa that's coming up in April, the first weekend of April. That is just about sold out with working spots, which is very exciting. My good friend Joe is hosting me down there, and he's done a really great job of promoting it and getting it set up, and it's going to be a really fantastic time. We will obviously be getting some videos, photo footage of that to share with you guys, and just a lot of exciting things. We've been really booking up with board and trains. We're totally jam-packed for the next almost 6 weeks now. I think we're completely booked up for. So lots of dogs coming in, lots of new stuff going on, and it's just really exciting moving into this new year here. Obviously January 1st being the first official year of business for Miracle Canine Training, and it's just been growing great. So staff's been killing it. Dogs have been killing it, clients have been killing it. It's just been a really great time. So with that being said, we're gonna jump into some questions here. We're gonna try to get back on a regular schedule. It might happen, it might not, I don't know, we'll find out. First question, this is a 2-part question here from Carmen OSU. Alrighty, so how do you suggest making a dog nervous of strangers, more comfortable with meeting people? And then the second part of the question is, what are your thoughts on teaching a dog to go say hi? Now, obviously 2-part question here. First, I'm gonna address the just getting dogs comfortable with meeting new people. This is something I talk about with clients very regularly who ask me things like, what's the best way to introduce a dog to new people? Usually this is pertaining to a dog who has had some sort of issues with people in the past, whether fear issues, whether aggression issues, whether, you know, overexcitability issues, whatever it may be. And I tell them all, when we have a dog that's uncomfortable with people, it's a multi-step process, because a lot of times when you're struggling with, say, having guests come over and the dog getting very reactive at the door or this or that, the last thing we need to be worried about at that point is the dog actually interacting with the person or teaching the dog to go say hi or anything like that, because the dog has not yet hit a point where they're even comfortable being in the presence of those people. So the first step is making sure the dog is getting comfortable being in the presence of people, right? I typically will use, say, a bed stay for this or whatever it may be, right? I'm gonna use some sort of stationary position I can keep the dog in where they can be around the people without the people messing with them, without them needing to worry about going up to the people and greeting them or anything. And what I wanna do is I wanna start to see the dog just get comfortable and acclimated to being around people in general, right? So once I start to get some consistency of that, whether it's a couple of weeks, whether it's a month, I don't know, it depends on how serious the case is, and I can get the dog just relaxing and chilling and just seeing the people in the area essentially as furniture. From there, what I'll do is I'll start just releasing them and letting them work at their pace. Now, this is where I'm gonna start to dive into that second part of the question, which is the idea of teaching dogs to say hi. This is a more new trend that I've been seeing a lot of dog trainers do, and that's where they're essentially teaching the act of going and touching somebody or going up and interacting with a person as a trick, right? So say there was somebody right here, I would teach them, go say hi, they would run over, bump their head on, you know, the hand or the leg or whatever it is of the person, and then they would come back to me to get a reward. Now, I'm not a very big fan of this. Now, the reason why I'm not a very big fan of this is because it's essentially, in my opinion, tricking the dog into an uncomfortable position, right? If your dog is uncomfortable with people and you're teaching them, hey, go up to this thing you don't like, touch it, and you're gonna get rewarded for it, yeah, they're gonna try to do that because they obviously want the reward, but the problem is, what happens if they go up to that person and the person starts interacting with them in a way that they don't necessarily like, and the only reason why your dog went over to them in the first place is because they want the treat that you have? It puts them in a very vulnerable position where you're asking them to make a choice that they might not be ready to make just yet, right? So I'm not a fan of doing that. I think that you have to work at the dog's pace when it comes to getting them a little bit more comfortable with people, and when you do hit that point where you start actually allowing them to interact, there should be no forcing the interaction, right? If your dog is loose in a room, if they're loose in your living room, and they just want to go lay in the corner by themselves and don't want to go up to a person, you can't force that, right? You can't force them to to go and make best friends with everybody. So acclimation first, teaching them don't worry about the person, don't worry about them. Second step, allowing them to coexist in the room and make decisions on their own of who they want to approach and who they don't want to approach. Throughout that process, obviously, if you were to see any sort of intimidating behavior or them going up and growling or anything, obviously we'd be correcting for those things, but you're giving them a little bit more freedom to be able to interact as they choose, and not even worrying about the actual, hand-to-hand interaction of like petting, scratching, loving until the dog is really comfortable enough for that yet. Take your time with it. When I first got Vinny, my Malinois, he had a lot of issues with people. He was very, very uncomfortable around them. And I would say for the first 4 months or so that I had him, anytime I had people come over my house, he was in a bed, stay in the corner by himself, just hanging out, not worrying about people, not worrying about them, needing to rush up to him or anything like that. And because of that, because I spent so much groundwork just getting him acclimated to being around people, now at this point, he wants to be everybody's best friend. He wants to run up to them and get pet all day, and he's very, very comfortable in those situations because I let him work at his own pace. So, hopefully that answers your question. We're gonna move on to the next one here. All right, question number 2. This is a training question. They have a leash reactive dog that has come a long way, but they want to strengthen their control by starting LAT training. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with this is look at that training. This is a very commonly used training practice in the positive only world. I'll get into this in just a minute. We were practicing at home first, but he has great eye contact under threshold. I can't get him to look away. At threshold, once he's at threshold, he won't make any eye contact. How can I improve our LAT consistency at home first? So I'm gonna answer this 2 ways. First and foremost is by making sure that you have a good enough understanding of what you should be doing with the LAT training. And then in addition to that, I'm gonna tell you why you shouldn't be doing that in the first place. So again, look at that training as an idea of being able to take a trigger, right? So if your dog is reactive towards people or dogs, and teach a more positive association with that trigger. So the example would be if I have a dog here, there's another dog over there. The second your dog looks at that trigger, you would be marking and rewarding. And the idea is that they're starting to condition that when they see this, to start anticipating getting a reward from you and looking to you. Now the problem with this is that most dogs are not, the reinforcement of them reacting towards the other dog, that feeling that they get, that adrenalized response that they have, is more self-reinforcing than any reward you're gonna throw at them. Now, in addition to that, I don't necessarily want my dog looking away from the trigger when they see these things, right? So my approach for working through leash reactivity is, 1, by making sure we're correcting for the actual reactive response, right? So making sure we're inhibiting the behavior that we're actually trying to stop first. At that point, I'll reinforce the correct behavior, right? The problem is if you're just using rewards for it, like you were saying, under threshold, when the dog isn't all amped up, you may have some success with it, but if you run into that off situation where, you run around a corner and there's a dog there, or suddenly there's a dog behind you and in front of you and you can't get away, and you can't physically keep your dog under threshold, you're only going to get so far. Now, with corrections in working through leash reactivity, a lot of people will make the problem of correcting for the wrong thing or nagging the dog. So this is, in the balance training community, a common problem that I see is people are telling people correct right when you see the dog make eye contact with the trigger, or right when they look at it, or if you see them perk up, or whatever it may be. But the problem is all those different emotional states that your dog is going through when they see these triggers, some of them they're not even fully aware of. You know what I mean? They're not conscious of it, so they can't necessarily just stop doing it if they're not aware of it. So I look for physical and very specific things to correct for. And one of those biggest things is the impulse of engaging in the trigger, right? Reactivity in general, I always say, is 90% of the time an impulse control issue, right? Obviously, in some cases, it's an issue of the dog being under-socialized and us needing to work through socializing that dog more to other dogs, right? But 90% of the time, it's the impulse control. It's the act of them seeing a trigger and needing to move forwards towards it, right? So what I want to do is I want to teach a dog to either not engage in it and not move forward, or actually move away from that trigger. So with that, I think it's unrealistic to say, hey, don't look at this trigger, right? Don't look at this dog, because sometimes they need to be able to take it in. If they're uncomfortable with it and they're looking the other way, and I'm trying to teach them, hey, look this way when the trigger's that way, but they're already uncomfortable with what's going on there, and now they can't see it, you could fall into this cycle really, really quickly where the dog just gets far more uncomfortable, right? So what I would recommend in your case is I would recommend one thing. First, making sure that your walk is perfect. I have a lot of videos on the YouTube channel of doing this. progress. We're gonna be making some new ones here soon, utilizing a remote collar, utilizing a pet corrector, things like that to make sure that the walk is perfect. Because if your walk isn't even perfect, you're chasing symptoms, right? You need the dog in a balanced, calm state of mind before you even see the other dogs, and making sure that they're not seeing that leash as any sort of restraint. When I see reactivity, so what I like to do is I like to come to a stop, I will let that trigger pass by, and instead of watching the trigger, and instead of watching my dog's eyes or their ears or anything like that, I'm watching their paws, and I'm gonna correct for the first motion towards that other dog. And I'm gonna correct at a fairly high level for that. So the second that I see a paw go, this, I'm marking with a no for that. I'm marking for that forward movement. I'm not asking them to sit, I'm not asking them to down, because I want them to have that ability to move backwards if they need to. I'm gonna repeat that cycle until my dog can constantly see other dogs and feel what it feels like to not engage in the trigger, to not engage towards it. Again, there's videos on the YouTube channel of this, so I want you guys to check those out as well. Once I have it consistent where my dog is not engaging in the trigger and they're, consistently looking, they're looking whether it's at the dog or at me or whatever it may be. From there, once I've inhibited that response, then you could add the rewards back into this, and you could reward for correct behavior. So if at that point you want to start your LAT training and you want to start rewarding for the dog looking at the trigger, you're more than welcome to, obviously, but you have to inhibit that response first. So reactivity is such a common problem. It's the number one thing that I see people come to here for. It's the number one thing that I see people who have worked with 2, 3, 4 other trainers before they come here. And it's because it's such a loaded problem and it's so dog dependent, right? Because you have dogs that are responding, again, out of fear, out of, being uncomfortable with the trigger and needing more socialization, out of the impulse control issue, out of their leash walking not being good enough. It could be so many different things. So like I would said, focus on those handful of things first, check out those videos that I have, and hopefully that helps answer your question. Question number 3, this is from Sanderson Cooper. My dog is crazy about mealtime. If it's within an hour or two, she scratches doors, whines, is hyper, etc. She doesn't even chew her food, she scarfs it down. Every time it's like she never had food before. What can I do? Okay. So this is another very, very big thing that I get asked quite frequently, especially with people who aren't used to having dogs that have food drive, right? So I use the example of my dogs, right? My dogs are basically food psychopaths. They will eat anything that's set down in front of them. The second that that bowl is down, they're eating everything that's in it. And I don't see this as a problem. And the reason why I don't see this as a problem is because I've essentially stopped my dogs from doing all of those annoying things that come with the food drive. The reason why people see the food drive as a problem with their dogs is because they don't have the control around those resources to be able to stop them from doing these things, right? So you said scratching at the door, barking, whining, all sorts of stuff like that are all things that I would consider inappropriate responses to, some sort of reinforcement that they want, right? So there's 2 things that you can do to work through this. One, and the more simple of the 2, is you need to gain the control around these resources, right? So when you have that food, you have something that the dog really wants. Teach them to work for it, right? Teach them to do obedience commands and stuff for it, and make sure that they're staying compliant and staying focused in that state of mind. And this is also a great way to proof your commands, because here's the thing. If you have something that your dog wants, but you can't actively get them to do something for it, there's a good chance that they don't actually understand what those commands or those words are, right? So if you're trying to get your dog to down, but they're too distracted by that food, then they don't really know what that word means, because if they knew what it was and they knew what you were trying to ask them to do and they knew that that was the reward for it, they would be doing it in the first place, right? So I'd recommend 1, working your dog for those things, and start by just asking one thing. Make your dog down before you give them the food bowl 100% of the time. If they're jumping around and bouncing all over the place and stuff while you're holding it, continue waiting and do not give them that resource until they lay down, right? You're gonna see after a couple of repetitions of doing that, they're gonna get very quick with it, and you're gonna see an immediate change in their focus in those states. From there, you can start adding other things into the mix. Now, the other thing is making sure you're providing consequences for those other things that you don't like. If it's an hour before mealtime and they know that it's coming and they're scratching at the door and stuff like that, those are physical things that the dog should not be allowed to do no matter what the distraction is, right? So in my case with my dogs, again, when I set that bowl down, they're not allowed to go for it even until I give them permission to go for it. I don't say anything, I don't need to beg them not to do it or anything, because they just understand that if they're to rehearse any of those things, there's some sort of consequence for it. So start pinpointing those very specific things that your dog is doing, start addressing them, start tying consequences to them, and in addition to that, make sure that you are reinforcing the correct things that you want to be reinforcing, right? So work them around it, attach consequences to those other things, and don't worry so much about the fact that your dog is super motivated, right? That's a very good thing. It helps us a ton in training. The only thing I would say is if you're having issues with your dogs, like eating too fast and say like regurgitating it or whatever it may be, which I had some issues with my dogs, you can go and get a slow feeder bowl or something. But don't try to kill that food drive. A lot of people just try to overfeed their dogs at that point and say, oh, my dog feels like they're hungry all the time, or, you know, it seems like they're starving or whatever. And again, like I use the example of, I just ate lunch an hour ago, right? And I'm still hungry right now. If I were left to my own devices, I would eat everything that's put in front of me all the time. So dogs are pretty darn similar to that. Don't worry about the food drive, just make sure you're achieving the control around it. So, last question here. Question number 3, this is from Emily McKee. How do you work through resource guarding? This is a very, very loaded question because there are tons of different types of resource guarding. There are tons of different ways to work through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a generalized answer to basically my thoughts on why dogs resource guard, some of the more common places that I see it, and then a handful of the ways that I go about working through it. So resource guarding in general is a dog protecting something that they deem as theirs. This is typically one of 3 things. One of 4 things. It's typically food, toys, praise and affection from humans, or space, right? More commonly than not, we see resource guarding with food and we see it with toys, right? So the idea of resource guarding is you have a dog that feels like they are left to their own devices. You feel like, or you have a dog that feels like they are in charge of different situations and that they need to deem what is appropriate and what is not appropriate from another dog or another person. When we see resource guarding with food, for example, right? A lot of times this is a dog that doesn't like the presence of people coming near their food and has learned that growling, barking, snapping, things like that typically will make people go away. With toys, we see toys commonly with other dogs. We have dogs that when they have a toy, if they're used to another dog coming and stealing it from them all the time, will start to learn that growling, barking, showing their teeth, snapping typically will make those other dogs go away when they try to do those things. With praise and affection, if I have a dog and the dog feels like they're in charge of the social interaction and I'm praising them, and say another dog or another person comes into their space, same deal. The barking, growling makes those other people go away. Same deal with space. So knowing that, we need to break down these individual sections and figure out one, what is the reinforcement behind why the dog is doing it in the first place, right? So in the case of affection, a lot of times it's because the people aren't actually in control of the social interaction, the dogs are actually in control of the social interaction. So how many times does your dog come up to you and shove their hand or their head under your hand or force some sort of affection out of you, right? And you know, they come over, they poke their head under your hand and you just start scratching them, right? That's the dog giving you an obedience command and telling you, hey, I want you to pet me in this situation. Now, if the dog is used to soliciting those things out of you, they're seeing you as a resource, right? And they're more likely to guard you. So the first thing you need to do is you would need to make sure that you're in charge of all those social interactions. Break down every single time you pet your dog or touch your dog or whatever it may be. Again, is your dog soliciting it out of you or are you in charge of that social interaction? In the case of toys, we see very commonly resource guarding start with dogs when another dog is constantly stealing things from them. So one of my big rules in my multi-dog household is that no dog is allowed to steal toys from the other. So if I catch one of my dogs laying there with a bone and the other coming over and looking like they're going to take it, I'm going to tell the dog that's going to try to take it, no, I'm handling this for you. And what that does is it puts the other dog in a position where instead of them feeling like they need to guard that resource from the other dogs, they know that I'm going to handle it for them. In the case of space, right? The dog is used to, again, if they're comfortable on their bed, us going into their space, making us go away, right? So instead of that, what I'll do is I'll practice situations where if I see my dog comfortable in a spot, I'll see, can I physically move my dog out of this place without actually touching them, right? You could utilize obedience for this. You could walk into their space and teach them to heed to that space, right? By moving towards them, and when you start to feel a little bit of like kind of pressure that you're putting on them, holding that that and waiting for them to make a decision of moving further away from you, right? Heeding to spatial pressure. And then lastly with the food, right? A lot of times dogs are used to the resource guarding building up simply from, you know, when they start growling or barking or whatever it may be, us moving away. So because I feel like this person is specifically asking about food, I'll kind of dive a little bit more into my process of working through that. With the food, and this is something I actually have an assessment video that I posted just a couple of days ago about this, resource guarding over food is usually either a learned behavior or a genetic behavior. So what I mean by that is if it's a learned behavior, it's something that the dog won't rehearse in a new environment. If it is a genetic behavior, it's something that the dog feels wired to rehearse anywhere, essentially. So once I determine that, what I need to do is first off figure out, can I stop the reinforcement just by hanging out in their space? So if I get a dog in for resource guarding, a lot of times I'll put them on a leash, I'll put that food bowl down, I'll hang out directly next to them, feed them, and I'll just stand next to them and wait and see what are they gonna do, right? If they start barking or growling or whatever, again, I'll continue to wait there and I'll continue to see, does this die down? Does the dog, after they go through some of this fit here, move away from the space? Do they continue to eat then after that? And in some dogs' cases, it's as simple as holding that leash, waiting through some of the little tantrum that they're gonna throw, assuming they're not actually trying to bite you. And eventually they just realize, oh, okay, cool, this guy isn't moving away, maybe I'll just eat, right? Sometimes, right? Other cases, that's not the case. Other times, they'll just leave and they won't eat at all. And in that case, again, I would consider that fairly successful, and I'll continue to repeat that process until the dog feels comfortable enough to eat in my presence, right? When you have dogs that are more intense about it, obviously, again, you need to attach consequences to that, which, again, I think I have a couple of videos on that we can kind of link in the comments below here. But what I'll do is I'll feed them, and if I start to notice like more serious aggression issues, again, I'll give some sort of consequence for that. I'll inhibit that specific behavior, whether using a remote collar, a pet corrector, a bonker, whatever it may be, and then teaching the dog to move away from that space by doing that, right? So we're teaching that when you start feeling too much pressure, instead of responding forward, like we were talking about with the leash reactivity, don't do that, obviously, because there's a consequence for it, move backwards, right? So as I'm approaching their space, when they get uncomfortable, they'll start backing away because they're predicting that consequence, and then I can start reinforcing for that specific behavior, right? Again, there's so many ways to work through this. It's so dog dependent. If I have a dog that I'm really concerned about actually being a bite risk, I'll use back ties. You'll see that there's little hooks on the walls back here. And you'll see in some of the videos I've posted about resource guarding stuff, I have the dog on a leash on a back tie so that I can approach that space. And if for whatever reason they were going to try to lunge at me or whatever it may be, they can only get so far, right? So I'm able to do this process a lot more safely. If I'm concerned about the dog only biting when an object is presented or when I'm reaching down towards them, sometimes I'll use like a broom or something and I'll poke towards the bowl with that just to gauge what they're going to do. But again, ultimately you need to figure out what the reinforcement is behind these things. Why is the dog doing it in the first place? And can I remove some of that and make these behaviors that they're showing non-reinforcing? And how far will I be able to get with that? From there, I need to inhibit any sort of aggressive responses that I see. And then lastly, obviously reinforce for the correct behavior. One thing that, again, I see a lot of trainers trying to do out there that I'm not a huge fan of is the idea of teaching dogs like out off of the food bowl or constantly recalling the dog away from it or, you know, doing a lot of obedience around it. And the reason why I'm not a fan of this is because, again, the dog is already uncomfortable with you being present around them. So if you're putting a lot more pressure on the situation by constantly asking them to do things, it could add more pressure to that situation and be a little bit more counterintuitive to what you're trying to accomplish. So again, when it comes to reactivity and things like that, or not reactivity, sorry, resource guarding and things like that, that's my typical approach for it. It just depends on what kind of resource guarding that you're seeing. And you just need to assess those couple of things while you're doing it. So again, quick little Q&A for you guys. 4 questions, 4 of the best ones that I thought that came through in the comments here. So we're gonna try and get a little bit more consistent about this. We're gonna start trying to cruise through these as we're in between lessons throughout the week. So keep on sending questions in. We'll keep continuing to try to answer them. We're really excited about everything going on up here right now. We're excited to continue keeping you guys posted about things. So we hope you enjoy it. Have a good week. Great, I'm done.